The story that I refer to as Avengers Postgame begins with Steve Rogers using the quantum platform in 2023 to travel into the past, landing immediately on the roof of the Sanctum Sanctorum in Greenwich Village in 2012, just out of sight of the Ancient One and the Hulk. She surrenders the Time Stone to Banner, and he travels back to 2023 with it, and without spotting Steve, the Ancient One tells him that he can come out. They head to the Sanctum's library, where Steve returns the Time Stone, while explaining that the Avengers were successful, but at great cost. And the Ancient One suggests that Steve's willingness to return the stones is part of what made him worthy to lift Mjolnir. He explains that his experience has shown him that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, so it follows that infinite power, like that of the stones, can only lead to infinite corruption. He explains that Thanos eventually succeeded in atomizing the stones, and the Ancient One suggests that doing so may allow the universe to begin healing from the trauma of the Big Bang, now that the energy that had been trapped within the stones has been freed to reintegrate itself into the fabric of reality, acknowledging that even in his rageful madness, Thanos may have done at least that much right. She goes on to explain that returning the stones will not eliminate any alternate timelines, but instead will preserve their integrity, and she tells Steve that time has its own sort of gravity. Without continual deliberate interference, a divergent reality will tend to realign itself with the timeline from which it deviated. After returning the Time Stone to the Ancient One in 2012, she agrees to help Steve return the rest of the stones to their proper times and places, using the Time Stone along with her sling ring to open a temporal portal to the interior of the Eugene Genetic Research Facility in Seoul, South Korea in May of 2015, immediately after Ultron had broken the Mind Stone out of the scepter and implanted it in the head of the vibranium body that would become the Vision. After Ultron escaped with the regeneration cradle, Steve crosses through the portal from 2012 to recover the discarded scepter, before seeing his 2015 self arrive to find Dr. Helen Cho. He then delivers the scepter to the Ancient One in the Sanctum, where she uses the Reality Stone to repair it and replace the Mind Stone in it. She then uses her sling ring to open a spatial portal to the interior of Stark Tower just across town, where Steve's 2012 self still lay unconscious on the concourse after having been incapacitated with the scepter by his 2023 self, and Steve crosses through the portal to replace the scepter before returning again to the Sanctum. The strike team then would have assumed that the version of Steve who had whispered "Hail Hydra" to Jasper Sitwell in the elevator had actually been Loki in disguise, given that Steve's 2012 self had told them exactly that when he encountered his 2023 self on the concourse. After Steve returned the Mind Stone to Stark Tower in 2012, the Ancient One again uses the Time Stone along with her sling ring to open a temporal portal to Himmelbjorg, the Bifrost Gateway building on Asgard, in 2013. Steve picks up Mjolnir, but before he can even cross through the portal, the Warhammer is pulled out of his hand, through the portal and across Asgard, having been summoned by Thor's time-displaced 2023 self. This means that when Thor time-traveled with Rocket Raccoon, he had not taken Mjolnir from his 2013 self, but instead had taken a variant that is permanently confined to its own looping temporal paradox. Steve then crosses through the portal, and Heimdall recognizes him and realizes that he has arrived from another timeline, because he can also see Steve's 2013 self on Earth at the same moment. Heimdall alerts Frigga, who teleports to the Gateway building and recognizes Steve, telling him, "You're one of Thor's friends from work." Steve returns the ether to her so that she can get it back to Jane Foster, and before Steve crosses back through the portal, Frigga asks him, "How are my sons?" Steve tells her that Thor is recovering from the darkness that he faced, but that Loki ultimately sacrificed himself trying to stop Thanos. Frigga just nods and answers, "Loki nearly murdered his brother on several occasions when they were children. And I asked him once, would it kill you to do the right thing?" I suppose now we know the answer to that question. After Steve returned the Space Stone to 1970, the Ancient One again uses the Time Stone along with her sling ring to open a temporal portal into the private office of Nova Prime Irani Rael within the Nova Corps headquarters building on Xandar in 2014. This time, the Ancient One crosses through the portal with Steve, and Rael insists that the intrusion is highly improper, before she and the Ancient One both laugh and shake hands, with Rael asking to what she owes the honor of a visit from the Sorcerer Supreme. The Ancient One tells Rael that they have unexpectedly come into possession of a cosmically dangerous artifact that needs to be safely returned, and Rael has a Xandarian exotic energy insulator delivered to the office by Roman Day. The Ancient One places the Power Stone inside the insulator and then gives it to Rael, who orders Day to deliver it to the artillery vault for safekeeping. In this case, the stone does not need to be returned anywhere near its original location, because this is the timeline in which Thanos captured Nebula and then traveled forward with his forces to 2023, where they were obliterated by Tony's use of the Nanogauntlet, thereby creating a divergent reality in which Thanos simply vanishes in 2014 and therefore never collects or uses the Infinity Stones to wipe out half of all life in the universe. Unfortunately, this Thanos-less time stream winds up being the one in which Christine Palmer dies in Stephen Strange's car wreck, driving him to become Strange Supreme. After Steve returned the Power Stone to Xandar in 2014, the Ancient One again uses her sling ring to open a spatial portal from the private office of Nova Prime Irani Rael to the Mountain of the Stone on Vormir. Steve crosses through the portal and climbs the path and encounters the Stonekeeper, who once again reveals itself to be Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull, who says, "Stephen Grant Rogers, son of Sarah, after all this time you haven't aged a day." Instinctively, Steve charges at Schmidt to attack him, but instead passes through his spectral form and tumbles over the edge of the cliff. Just before he crashes into the ground below, another portal opens and he falls through it onto the couch back in Rael's private office on Xandar, where the Ancient One tells him that he must be more careful. Steve crosses back through the portal to Vormir, where Schmidt is amused to find him alive, and tells him, "I suppose you can do this all day, but so can I." Steve shows him the Soul Stone, and Schmidt is genuinely confused when he asks where Steve got it. Steve tells him that one of his friends sacrificed herself for it, and Schmidt seems amused when he answers, "Not yet." Steve then realizes that he has arrived before Clint and Natasha, and that the Soul Stone they took is still at the bottom of the cliff. He also discovers that possessing the stone makes him the master of it, and that Schmidt is a servant of the stone. And Steve uses that power to imprison Schmidt inside the Soul Stone, knowing that Thanos will destroy the stone 9 years later. He then waits on the mountaintop until Clint and Natasha arrive, and both are shocked to find Steve on Vormir. He explains that he has renegotiated the terms of the trade, and hands the stone to Clint, then tells them that Clint can return to the future with the stone, but Natasha cannot, because she was not originally present during the events that happened there. Clint and Natasha say their goodbyes before Clint activates his time-space GPS and returns to 2023. And Steve and Natasha both cross back through the portal together to rejoin the Ancient One in Irani Rael's private office on Xandar. The three of them then cross back through the portal to the Sanctum Sanctorum in 2012, where the Ancient One asks Steve where or when he and Natasha will be headed now that the stones have been returned. And Steve looks at Natasha for a moment before answering, "Home." After Steve returned the Soul Stone to Vormir in 2014 and averted the death of Natasha Romanoff in that alternate timeline, the two of them used their time-space GPSs and the last of their PIM particles to both travel back to November of 1945, where Steve reunites with Peggy in Washington, D.C. He immediately explains that he and Natasha are from one possible future and that his present 1945 self is still alive in the Arctic, and in this moment, Steve's actions result in the creation of a divergent timeline. That timeline does not get pruned by the Time Variance Authority, however, because Sylvie's actions at the Citadel at the end of time will have reopened the multiverse at all points throughout time. Steve, Natasha, and Peggy contact Howard Stark, as well as the rest of the Howling Commandos, and orchestrate two missions. One to recover Steve's 1945 self from the wreckage of the Valkyrie, and one to extricate Bucky Barnes from Hydra custody. Peggy and Howard lead the mission to the Arctic and discover the crashed Hydra bomber plane buried in the ice with Steve's shield still inside, but Steve's 1945 self is missing. Meanwhile, Steve, Natasha, Dugan, Jones, and Marita locate Barnes in a Soviet prisoner of war camp and rescue him along with the rest of the soldiers, including Allied Intelligence Bureau agent Joseph Fury. The facility is destroyed during their escape, but unknown to the Strategic Scientific Reserve, the Soviets had already collected genetic samples from their subjects that will later be used to conduct the Winter Soldier program in this new timeline. By the beginning of 1946, Steve, Peggy, Howard, and Fury create the foundations for S.H.I.E.L.D., and Steve begins using his knowledge of the future to plan to contact particular crucial individuals, such as Janet Van Dyne, Hank Pym, King T'Chaka, and the Ancient One, as well as preventing certain terrible events from occurring, such as the infiltration of the United States military and government by Hydra operatives that began in May of 1945 with Operation Paperclip. As Steve uses his knowledge to further edit history, the changes will cause unanticipated effects that Steve is not prepared for, but he will also discover that even when he changes some things, those events may still occur by other means, because, as the Ancient One told him initially, time has its own sort of gravity, and a divergent reality will tend to realign itself with the reality from which it deviated.